Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. Thank you so much for tuning in. I took a break last week because it turns out school, when it starts, it gets like super hectic, and I work currently in education, so wasn't expecting that, but it's been a little stressful lately. So I did take a break. Hopefully, though, I will have an extra episode that I was working on last week. Hopefully, I'll be able to upload that and give you guys a bonus episode this weekend, but we'll see how that goes. But for this week, I read The Devil and the Dark Water by Stuart Turton, who is a familiar face for A.Idle. I actually reviewed his debut novel, The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. So if you're interested, definitely go back and look at that episode. I want to say it was season 1, episode 2. So if you're looking for more from him, I would definitely pick that book up. And I will be referencing that book maybe a few times in this review just because it's relevant. And they are very similar. Now, this book, The Devil in the Dark Water, was released in 2020. And again, it's the follow-up to The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. And they have very similar premises on paper. And by that, I mean, if you really oversimplify both plots, you'll kind of get very, similar answers. And that's because both stories involve a variety of characters, and a lot of them at that are tasked with solving a crime that technically hasn't happened yet. And so along with us, the audience, we all know something bad is going to happen, and you're kind of trying to piece together what in the world is going on in order to save a person or this person or a group of people. And so it's certainly sticking to that kind of murder mystery-esque thing, but there's a lot going on in this book that really added to the draw of it. So when you really look at it in like on paper, I would certainly say that if you liked his first book, you will enjoy this book as well. But I just wanted to point out that he certainly has a particular style of writing, and he does it very well. Now, this is set in 1634, and it is a ship full of characters battling against the devil, in case you didn't catch that in the title. So we also have a few evil, mysterious events that plague the crew, which in turn spreads a lot of hysteria. As you can imagine, being in the year 1634, stuck on a ship, and something bad happens, you can't just pick up your cell phone and, call for help. So it made a lot of sense that all of the events described on the back cover of the book would cause just chaos. And honestly, this can all be summed up by one of the characters. Captain Dretch, Drecht. And that's another thing I just want to get into right now. When I read a fiction book, if you haven't guessed by now, the way that I read a name of a character sticks with me throughout. So if I'm saying these characters wrong, I'm just going to continue to say it wrong, because now I associate that name with, how I have painted this character in my mind. But character Dretch, he summed it up quite perfectly. There are too many damn secrets on this ship. And honestly, like every other chapter, there was another theory that I was coming up with as to why this was all happening. And what we found out later is that there was a lot of stuff we didn't know, which, that's real life as well. So now, before we jump into the characters, I just want to point out that there is a really awesome few pages in the back of the book titled Conversation with the Author, which is, as you guessed it, a conversation with the author. And it's just a few questions that are probably frequently asked of him. And he answered and gave his meaning behind, like writing the book and where he got the inspiration, blah, 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 stuff like that. But he did address that Sherlock Holmes and Watson, his kind of sidekick, was certainly an inspiration for two of our characters. And he described it as writing a Sherlock Holmes and a Watson who, quote, wasn't just asking daft questions. So essentially, we have a Sherlock Holmes and a Watson that is equally as capable as him. And that came in the form of Sammy, who we'll discuss in just a second, and Arndt, who is the quote unquote Watson. So I wanted to do characters first because since there are a lot of them, I wanted to pull out, before we even jumped into the theme or any of the literary devices, who the main characters were that had an impact on me. Now, again, this is a ship full of people, and I can say that there's probably 10 characters that I could have written about, but I want to keep this episode, to my 30-minute average here. And also, I didn't want to give too much away. So this episode, I think, will be fairly spoiler free. So I didn't give a spoiler warning, but just pulling certain characteristics out of these few, I think it's 4 or 5 that I mapped out, should be fine. You should go into it with a better understanding of what exactly is going on without a spoiler. So Samuel Pepys, he's probably, I would say, in a way, the most central character to this plot, because we're introduced to him the first page of the book. He is a very well-respected detective that represents that honor, that valor, that thing that people can't come across. Apparently, they can't come across it ever in this day and age. But all this to say that he's someone who is admired, and there's good reason for it. So we open up with his arrest, him in shackles, essentially being marched onto the ship as a prisoner, and people physically assaulting him, verbally abusing him. And right off the bat, we know that this is not right. So you could say that his arrest is essentially a catalyst for the plot. But if you want to take it at maybe the least, I would say it's certainly a cause for concern. We can see that something is not right. And that's our first kind of picture that something's off. It's this person who was weeks before, days before, was solving, these crimes and these murders that everyone was so vested in, and publishing these reports where he described how he took down these criminals. And now he's being treated like the lowest of the lowest criminals. And what's even shocking about all of this is no one knows what he's being accused of. Now, what we find is also something that Stuart wrote in the conversation with an author in the back of the book, is that a lot of Samuel, or Sammy, is characterized by Arndt, who is one of his best friends, who is his partner in this whole chasing down criminals things. And so everything we know of him is information that we learned from Arndt, which I've spoken about this when we have first person narratives. It's important to acknowledge that there could be, and there will be, some sort of bias there, because when you're in the mind of one person, you're only experiencing the events from that person's point of view. Now, with this book, it is written in third person perspective, meaning we're kind of looking down from the sky at all of these events. We can see everything happening in the ship, but because Samuel, as you'll see in the plot, is locked up for the majority of it, we're not really observing his interactions with other people. So we're relying on the past knowledge of Arndt to paint this picture of Sammy. So this entails the power of characterization. You don't have all of the facts when we're just looking at one person's not perspective, but one person's report of who a person is, who another character is. You can't really trust that because they don't know all the facts. You may understand and recognize your experiences with one person, but you don't know maybe how they treat other people or what they've done in the past. And so what we see is, this is a great example of how Arndt, and many other, but specifically him, his ignorance contributed to the plan working perfectly. And it's not willing ignorance. It's just that literally him not understanding certain facts about the ship as a whole, the story as a whole, contributed to this whole plot taking place, this evil, plot that we see is very complex and was conjured over time. Now, he also gave Arndt some advice on solving crimes, and that was hold on to what you know until you know what it means. This is very, I think, Sherlock-esque of our character, that being that you have to really observe, in particular, a crime scene and the things that you may not think are important, or the things that you maybe take for granted at a crime scene. You need to pay attention to those things, because later on, when you do get more information, you're able to plug in what was going on, what that could have meant or represented. So just, I forget what he said, but paying attention to the things that are at a crime scene and the things that are not and should be. Things like that supports his character as being one of the best detectives ever, but also it's great advice for the audience. So just paying attention as you read to the signs maybe that are there within a person's character traits. Maybe if you notice a character flaw, just taking note of that so that you're able to further understand their place in this whole story, maybe what side they might be on. So now we have Arndt Hayes, and his name, by the way, is spelled A-R-E-N-T. So Arndt, I've just been saying Arndt. So right away, he's characterized as being very protective. He's physically shielding Sammy from the rocks that are being thrown at him when he's being led onto the ship. He describes himself as a second to Sammy, even though they kind of have a partnership, but he does see Sammy as someone above him in a way that maybe like a father figure would be, someone who he can learn from, but also someone who he has essentially sworn to himself to protect. And what this represents, his relationship with Sammy, it really represents his loyalty to the good side of things. So what we see is his connections are based on how much fairness he sees in someone, how much trustworthiness he senses from someone, what type of honor do they have. And all of this in his eyes was represented through Sammy. And when later on down the line, when he was meeting new people, we found that the relationship started to mature a little bit faster once they showed an act of fairness, or once they showed an act of honor. So people that he started out as strangers with on this trip, once he was able to kind of gauge where they were on that spectrum, that's when, the friendship, went further along, or romance or whatever may have you. Next is Sarah Wessel, who is the husband of General John Hahn, who on this ship is the top of the top. He's someone who is very powerful, very wealthy, and she essentially wants for nothing. She's a very rich person by being married to him, but we also find that he's kind of a terrible person. So she's suffering, and she is described by the narration as being a caged animal, because she enjoys all the luxuries of life, but fearing backlash or karma, basically, from the outside world, she's locked away on orders of John, because he wants to protect, what's his, and he really does kind of view her as his property. And what we'll see, we're going to talk about gender a little bit later on in this review, but keep in mind this is 1634, and so it's not like she really had the freedom to do whatever she wanted on her own anyway. But had she had a husband who maybe was a little more respectable, she would have been able to enjoy life a little bit more. But she is kind of hardened by all of this, and right away we find that she is defiant to her situation. She's not a bad person, but she's willing to disobey her husband in order to save her friend and her children. Once we all find out that the ship has been cursed, she immediately defies her husband and tries to get her friend to, get off the ship and, go home and save them, even if that meant that her herself might be in danger. Also, another thing we see early on is her act of kindness towards the leper. And he's a character who, at the beginning, is someone who is first of all, seen as very low class. Second, has some type of disease. Nobody really wants to go near him for fear that a plague is going to spread, things like that. And she shows him kindness just by talking to him, just by approaching him and giving him like some sort of I think it was like a sleep medication or something to help him with his pain that he was clearly in. So she's one of the good guys. Finally, General John Hahn. A very prideful person, and he's wealthy, he's rich, and he is wealthy and rich for a reason. What we find is a lot of people in those positions during this time period didn't get there, just walking down the street and being a good person. They slaughtered, soldiers in the battlefield. They fought for their money and their position. And he's no different. He's someone who has made a lot of enemies. But what could be expected from someone who has that much wealth? He's also someone who leaves no decision to those around him. He doesn't let people make decisions for him. He's in a high place. He intends to protect that place by portraying to everyone that he is the only one in control of his life. Even if that means that he tries to tempt fate, he will bargain with fate if he can. And, just try to make it so that he gets his way, or at least he has some type of hand in the life that he lives. So with that being said, Turton's writing style is something that I have come to really enjoy. Again, we talk about the premise of, this being very similar to Evelyn Hardcastle, that book. But he has a particular way of introducing characters. So without explanation, we kind of jump into each story. It's kind of like we're following a character through a movie. And I want everyone to visualize that with this particular book, it's like we're looking down at everything taking place. With the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, you were physically being put into someone's body every other chapter. So it was hard to keep up with. I think, I don't know if he read the reviews for the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, but a common critique that I heard was that it was kind of jarring to go from character to character, which that was the book, so I don't know why people were upset. But being that this book was from third person, it kind of like took away some of that sting, but it still kept his unique style of just throwing characters in there and kind of relying on you not really paying attention to that, because literally a perfect example of this is Sander and Isabel, who are characters that are fairly important, but we don't get much page time with them. And when they're first introduced, I think it was like 2 pages of literally just them hopping on the boat. And it's like, who are these people? And then that was it for like the next 50 pages. And then we, got to know them a little bit better. But just kind of him throwing that in there, I really enjoy stuff like that, because obviously he's not putting a random 2-page paragraph on these 2 characters in there for no reason. So I like that stuff, and I think that that's a good way to placate the people who maybe didn't like the introduction to the characters in his other book. But either way, it's great. So what we find is that the narration doesn't start with the beginning of any specific character's stories. Really, what we see is that the story starts with the boarding of the Sardam, which is the name of the boat. So even though we're introduced to Sammy first, you have to ask yourself, okay, if this is a story about Sammy, why didn't we see him actually get arrested? We come to where he's being dragged onto the boat in chains. Or if this is a story about Arndt, why didn't we go back to when he was a kid or something like that? So there's no real main character here. The real main character is the ship, if you ask me, because that's where we're starting the story, and the ending of the ship is where we end the story. So pros of this, of course, is that the little information encourages attention to detail and to the story, because you just kind of get thrown off a little bit, but then it's like, okay, this might mean something, so let me pay attention. Cons, of course, is that the audience may be confused or unsettled, but I love that feeling. Another thing that Turton did was that with all of the characters, there was a clear emphasis on the physical characteristics of everyone. In particular, the contrasting physical characteristics between Arndt and Sammy at first, and then literally Arndt and everyone else. It was to point out that he was physically very strong, and therefore he had some sort of power to claim on this ship, whether he was nobility or not, whether he was a sailor or not. He had physical strength, and if he had to fight somebody, he could. Another funny thing I enjoyed that Turton included towards the end of the book is the emphasis that this is obviously a fiction book. He stated that he did his research and then he threw away the bits that hindered the story. And I just love this quote because, you know, obviously with nonfiction books, it's important to do your research because you're reporting on real stuff. But with fiction books, I love it when they're historically accurate, but obviously that can't always be the case. It's a fiction book. It's not real. So he did kind of include that in there, that some of the what do you say, like the systems weren't necessarily time period appropriate, or maybe some of the dress. He knows that. So if you're going to nitpick the story, like seriously, who does that? Like, who sits there and thinks of everything that's wrong and not period accurate? It's a fiction book. But I enjoyed that, the fact that when he acknowledged that he did the research, and then to be able to sift through it and apply what you can to your story, that's really notable. He also said that when writing a book, he starts writing with who he wants dead first, so that he knows, you know, kind of like the end, what's supposed to happen, and then he develops the plot from there. So that was pretty funny. Also, I don't know if that's a spoiler. This book is called The Devil in the Dark Water. Like, somebody's gonna die. Just so we all know. Okay, before we get into the themes, another thing is Old Tom is discussed a lot. That is the name that pretty much everyone has for the devil. And this, he said, was based on a demon, and that demon's name was Astaroth. A demon that preyed on the people who were lazy and who would, you know, trade a favor for fortune, much like Old Tom. Now, the best theme from this book, hands down, was the commentary on mob mentality and mass hysteria. For those who are not familiar, a great example of this that is taught in every English class is the Salem witch trials, which happened in the 1690s, so about 50 years after this would have taken place. But also the Red Scare, and that was 1917 and 1920-ish. Essentially, it's when a bunch of people are convinced that a thing or a person or a group of people is bad, and so everyone's running around scared of them, scared that other people are conspiring with them. In this case, it's the devil and it's evil. Turton purposely included superstition in this story because he said it was a notable part of history, of this period in history. And he researched how we collectively began to believe untruths. This is not something that has, in my opinion, has ever gone away. It's just that the things that people are outraged at has changed year after year. But time and time again, we see where there's these movements of people acting irrationally and trying to save themselves against some, whatever it is, if it's witches, if it's the devil, it's whatever. And it's funny because early on, Captain Krause actually says that superstition is the only thing that's keeping us afloat. And that's because the sailors in particular were very superstitious. A lot of them carried charms on their neck and would rub it for good luck. If there was a room that was said to be haunted, they would go out of their way to avoid it. And so the sailors really were kept in line by trying to abide by, you know, God or religion or whatever it was. So in the beginning, that's kind of what saved them. But in the end, when you get it into people's minds that there's something on the loose, it's very easy in a group setting like this, especially this ship is isolated on the ocean, for it to spread and for the fear to rise, and it just causes chaos. And that's what we see in this book. An early on example of this is when everyone was throwing rocks at Sammy without knowing what the accusation was. And he actually says that they were surrendering themselves to the devil. Early on, he says this. And it's crazy because when you really think about it, no one knew what the accusations against Sammy were. Not even Sammy. He didn't know. And so for everyone to turn on him so quickly, when before, again, he was this well-respected person, everyone enjoyed him, they enjoyed his work, and now everyone is just trying to kill him? Like, what goes on in the mind of people? Hysteria. Like, it's them getting into groups, coming up with their own theories of what may have happened, and then running with that, letting the fear and the adrenaline kind of keep them very high and taking all of their frustrations in life out on this one thing that in their minds has caused all of their problems and their troubles, which couldn't be farther from the truth, but you know. And then when we talk about the effort to contain the hysteria that, when you really look at it, was very slowly rising as the plot went on, Sarah had a pretty quick, short, but scary encounter with someone representing old Tom, and she was told kind of to keep her experience under wrap so that she wouldn't cause hysteria, because they knew if that got out, then every time someone heard something out of the norm on the ship, they would automatically think, okay, that's evil. Or maybe if someone talks in their sleep, okay, that person is clearly with the devil, because why are they talking in their sleep? These things can run out of hand so very quickly. So everyone was aware of that. And I think in the end, we see how hysteria can manipulate people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, how one can benefit from hysteria and kind of slip through the cracks. But I think all of our characters were aware of it. It was just whether they were going to contribute to it, be sucked into it, or just kind of stay on the outside and let it work for them. The second theme is order, and that was part of the order was trying to keep the hysteria down, but there was an emphasis on maintaining order, specifically through the sailors. And there were plenty of comments that you had to keep this one person alive, or whoever was in charge of the sailors had to be a terrible person who everyone was scared of, because if he wasn't, the sailors would run all over him and kill him. And once they killed that person, then the sailors would run amok. So the sailors were really given a bad rep. They're kind of the low of the low, people who really don't have much else outside of the ship itself. And so there was a push to have someone there that could control them, because controlling them really meant order to the ship. And in a way, I guess that was a correct assumption, but really it was kind of keeping them in line, keeping the soldiers in line, keeping the passengers in line. The ship needed order in order to make it to its destination, which honestly I never really thought of. But I guess, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that is obnoxious. I hate when cars or motorcycles, whatever, I hate when they do that rolling down the street. Anyway, I don't even know what I was saying. Okay, order, that's done. All right, so the next theme here is the promise of fortune. And there's not much really to say to this other than everyone had something that they were running towards. For the majority of people, it was wealth, it was money, it was things, status. And so when it came time to really push on that fear of the devil, it wasn't hard to get people to agree to do heinous things in order to move up, the hierarchy, or in order to get a big payday so they could finally take care of their family. There were so many times when people said out of their mouths they were promised this in order to contribute to the plan. And it's like, if everyone sat back and thought about this, so all of y'all were promised all of this money. First of all, where is all of this money coming from? Second of all, how many people were promised X, Y, and Z? It's just interesting how just saying, I can promise you, I can give you all this money if you do this or if you do that. A lot of that came out towards the end of the book, and it got so repetitive that I kept getting annoyed. And I'm like, how could this keep working? But it makes sense. If you promise someone the one thing that they've always wanted, or the one thing that they've been thinking about for years, I guess it's not hard to, really manipulate that, which is sad, but it makes sense. And lastly, we have fear. So fear is, I think, the most commonly used motivator when it comes to this entire plot. A lot of people acted out of fear that they were going to remain in the situation they were in, out of fear that they were going to end up in a worse situation. I think it was used as a scapegoat at times. Some people that were caught in compromising situations would say that I did this because I was afraid, but you'll see that was a contributing factor to the hysteria. Everyone was afraid. They were just scared. That was it. And you can't really blame them for acting so stupid. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them acted so stupidly out of fear. And it's like it contributed to the crumbling of the entire ship. So, alrighty, just a few more literary devices. So the first is obviously symbolism. So we have the mark of Old Tom, the mark of the devil, which is described as, it looks like an eye with a tail. So it's seen as something mysterious but malevolent and unknown. So if you see that mark, people get scared. When Arndt was talking about his childhood, he said that he carved that symbol into a few houses and people gave it power. People said, oh, that symbol's on your door, you're evil. And it's like, when you find that the people actually gave life to this thing and it just spread like wildfire. And you see it was carved by a child who didn't really know what was going on, whether he contributed to it or not. He didn't have any ill intentions when carving it onto the door, but the people kind of, went into that fear. And then, much like the Salem witch trials, people started using it to their advantage. Turton uses personification a lot, again, with describing the character's physical traits. He says that, I want to say it was Leah he was talking about. Her hair falling down her arm like black water. That contributes to us being able to visualize what's happening. And then lastly, red herring, who, again, Turton purposely included that. But, what's a mystery novel without a red herring? I'm always on the lookout for those. But I think a perfect example is when Isabella is caught in kind of like a compromising situation and she's accused of being, doing something she's not supposed to be doing. When we see the last sentence of that paragraph or the last sentence of that chapter is, and an unknown figure escaped silently. So it's like, she was purposely used to say, okay, that's suspicious. But then there's someone else watching them have their little, encounter and watch them accuse her. Whereas, the real culprit is out there and got to sneak away. But there are a few red herrings. Obviously, I don't want to point them all out because for those that don't know, a red herring is something that is purposely put in the plot that is meant to make the audience think, something's happening when it's not. It's the complete opposite, or it's a different character or whatever. Okay, last thing before my review, I wanted to talk on class and gender, which is a motif throughout this book. Sarah said, the narration describes Sarah as being the highest ranking noblewoman on board, yet she had less freedom than the lowliest cabin boy. So what she was saying was she's very wealthy, being married to the general, but she wasn't even allowed to leave her room at times without her husband's permission. Whereas even the poorest of the poor passengers were out walking around. Well, they had no room, so they had to walk around because they didn't really have a place to go. But she didn't have that freedom, even acquiring the highest wealth that she could get on that ship. And so that just speaks on the role of gender during these time periods, where it was even discussed that you could be a woman who cries in a mansion, who cries, behind a guarded wall, or you can be a woman that is being taken advantage of in the streets, poor, not being able to provide for your children. And I think that was a good way of framing what Sarah was battling with, because she wanted so very dearly her freedom to get out of there. But it's like in these times, being a woman, you kind of really didn't have a choice but to choose a man, a husband that would provide protection for you. And what's the best protection besides wealth? You could literally pay for guards. You can command respect from soldiers. So Sarah, unfortunately, was put in a really tough position. And honestly, it really didn't, in my opinion, she really didn't get what she wanted in the end. I don't want to give too much away, but I would love to know how you guys think that she ended up. And I think that was a question as well in the reading guide from Turton. Do you think that she ended up with, her happy ending or whatever? Because in my opinion, I think she wanted to be by herself with some money and her child and be done with it, but I would love to hear what you guys think of that. So I enjoyed this book. If you haven't noticed, I really liked Turton's debut. I think it was one of the more unique books I had ever read, more interesting books I had ever read. This one was really good. I think it was definitely a slow burn type of book where I was kind of like riding along the plot. There wasn't too many points in the book where I was kind of feeling like the plot was, or the narration was climaxed or anything like that. It was very like a rise. And you kept kind of going to the top. The ending blew my mind. And it's funny because this is one of those books, I would say, like Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, where you have so many different theories that don't make sense. Or that every other paragraph or page, it's like there's another reason why that theory doesn't work. Or why whoever you think is behind this isn't. And it keeps changing. It keeps going back and forth. And so I enjoyed the ending. I really enjoyed Turton as a writer, and he said that he's going to publish another book in 2 years, and I'll definitely be picking that up. He's certainly made a fan out of me. This is the second book that has kept me thoroughly entertained, and I'm certainly going to keep this. Usually with other books, after I'm done reading them, I'll just sell them back to the bookstore. But I'm keeping this, and I kept the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. So I really enjoyed these books. I really, really loved it. And I would certainly recommend it to everyone. This is going to be one that I reread. And I think that, especially with this time period, it's October. We're getting closer to Halloween. This is a really good Halloween read. I didn't finish it all in one day, though. This took me 3 days. Because I kept putting it down and coming back, putting it down and coming back. I think if you're up to the task, because this is almost 500 pages, I think it would be worthwhile to read it all day, though. Just straight through. That's what I should have did, but it was good nonetheless. And I think, above anything, key takeaways we have here are, everyone has a price that they will pay for their fortune. And I think that most people are not forced to pay that price unless they're in super compromising positions, but everyone has a price. And if you want to wreak havoc on a bunch of people, you need to plan it very well, okay? Unrelated to that, I think people who do bad stuff or people who want to be criminals, you got to be smart to do that. Or at least intelligent. You got to have some type of common sense. If nothing else, that's what this book showed me. Even though that's kind of the wrong way to describe things, but it was very meticulously planned. I'll put that there. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another episode. I will see you guys next week. Hopefully, I'll be able to put another episode out this weekend. Fingers crossed. But if not, worst case scenario, you'll just hear from me again next Thursday. I hope everyone has a good weekend, and thank you so much.